Alright, my friends, the time has come. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the end of the Aztec campaign, the point where the independent Aztec Empire comes to its dramatic close. Up until now, the story of the Aztecs has actually been quite a successful one. Most recently, they even managed to drive the Spanish conqueror Hernán Cortés out of Tenochtitlan during the infamous Noche Triste, the sad night, chasing him all the way into the Mexican jungle. East of Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs finally caught up with the Spaniards, but then came disaster. On July 7th, 1520, they stumbled right into a Spanish ambush at the Battle of Otumba. The Aztecs were defeated, forced to retreat back to Tenochtitlan, while the Spanish barely escaped and made it to their allies, the Tlaxcalans, where they could recover. Now, the relationship between the Tlaxcalans and the Aztecs is important here. These two peoples were bitter enemies, something like sworn rivals. So when the Tlaxcalans had to choose between fighting against the Spanish or joining forces with them, they figured better to ally with the newcomers than to face the Aztecs alone again. And so the Tlaxcalans and the Spanish teamed up to take on the mighty Aztec Empire. But while the Aztecs managed to hold their enemies at bay for a while, they were struck by a different, invisible enemy, one they didn't even know existed. The Spanish had unknowingly brought smallpox with them, a highly contagious virus that was completely new to the Aztecs. Their immune system had no defense, and countless people died because of this disease. The epidemic tore through their population, wounding the Aztec Empire more deeply than any battle ever could. In fact, both sides, Aztecs, Spanish, and their allies, needed time to recover. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were fighting to contain the smallpox outbreak, to rebuild their supplies, and to restore order in the city. In September 1520, they appointed a new ruler, Cuauhtémoc, who's also the narrator of our campaign. Meanwhile, the Spanish were healing up as well, and by the time the epidemic finally ended in December, they had been given exactly what they needed: time. Time to regroup, time to plan, and even time to receive reinforcements from both Cuba and Spain. Now, piecing together the exact order of events is a little tricky. Different sources tell different stories. My own take is this. During this period, Cortés sent one of his most trusted men, Diego de Ordaz, back to Spain. His mission? To present Cortés' story to the Spanish court and secure him the official title of Governor of New Spain. And here's something fascinating. When I looked closer at Diego de Ordaz's role, I finally understood just how deeply other indigenous people despised the Aztecs. There are reports that, for example, the Tlaxcalans were genuinely grateful to de Ordaz, just because he stepped in more than once to stop acts of Aztec abuse and violence against them. To much of Mexico, the Aztecs weren't heroic rulers. They were seen as cruel overlords with overwhelming power. To some, the Spanish didn't look like invaders at all, but almost like liberators. Of course, we need to keep in mind that many of our sources were written by the Spanish themselves, so the narrative is biased. Still, it's very likely that a lot of people in Mexico were hoping for the Aztecs' reign to finally come to an end. And that brings us back to Cortés and his big master plan. In the safety of Tlaxcala, he ordered massive amounts of timber to be cut for shipbuilding. Why, you may ask? Well, because his plan was to turn Tenochtitlan's greatest strength, the fact that it was built on an island, against itself. You see, Tenochtitlan was nearly impossible to conquer by land. It was a city on a man-made island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland only by a few causeways. Cortés realized if he could control the waters around the city, he could cut the Aztecs off completely. Even if the Spanish couldn't storm the city by force, the Aztecs would eventually starve. So, starting in February 1521, Cortés and his Tlaxcalan allies began attacking smaller towns around Lake Texcoco to secure safe access to the water. This also cut off Aztecs from vital tribute payments, especially food. By mid-April, they dealt another blow by defeating Xochimilco, which at the time was the Aztecs' most important ally. Piece by piece, the wood for the ships was hauled to the lake. Thanks to the back-breaking labor of the Tlaxcaltecs, by the end of April, the Spanish had built 13 large ships, fully armed with cannons. With these ships, Cortés now had a secure base on Lake Texcoco from which to attack Tenochtitlan. And his gamble paid off. The naval blockade worked. The Aztecs were isolated, unable to bring new supplies into the city. By May 1521, the full-scale siege of Tenochtitlan had begun. And with that, we've bridged the gap between the last mission of our campaign and this final one. In this mission, we'll relive the siege itself, still through the eyes of the Aztecs, of course.
Passed down to you by Cuauhtémoc, Emperor of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish will return soon. I had hoped that Cortés would continue fleeing back from whence he came, but he had stopped to regroup at Tlaxcala. I imagine that he could not stand the thought of returning to Spain while we still had treasuries of gold hidden from him. Still dreaming of gold and glory, the Spanish pledged themselves to another assault on Tenochtitlan. In Tlaxcala, Cortés constructed many warboats on dry land. Then he had the crafts broken down and carried through the rainforests, only to be rebuilt on Lake Texcoco. He knows that my Aztec warriors can defend the bridges leading into Tenochtitlan, but we are vulnerable from the water. I called the warriors to one final battle. The priests attempted to encourage the troops by calling upon the Aztecs to defend their ancient gods and their glorious city. They sent up smoke signals to declare that the Aztecs were ready for war as I climbed the steps of the great temple and sounded the shell trumpet. Tenochtitlan would be under siege soon, and the brave Aztecs would die before we would see her captured.
Well then, let's try to do the impossible, to stop the inevitable and prevent the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan. Our goal is clear: defeat the Spaniards and their allies, the Tlaxcaltecs. In this mission, the Spanish are actually split into two opponents. On the one hand, we'll be facing Cortés's land army, and on the other, his fleet. And of course, the third enemy on the map is the Tlaxcaltecs. The stage for this final battle is, naturally, Tenochtitlan and the surrounding lands. The map is exactly the same one we saw back in Mission 4, La Noche Triste, only this time, instead of trying to capture Tenochtitlan, we'll be defending it against the invaders. That means it's a water map, with Tenochtitlan itself sitting as an island right in the center. Tenochtitlan is heavily fortified. There's towers and castles and gates guarding the three causeways that stretch west, south, and east toward the mainland. Although there's no walls, because Tenochtitlan had no walls, it is pretty much inaccessible for the enemy. The starting situation for the Aztecs here feels very true to history. We have no allies to call upon, and we're trapped in Tenochtitlan, surrounded on both land and water. Yes, there are resources in the city, but they are limited. We're essentially playing against a ticking clock. There's also the Aztec wonder inside Tenochtitlan, and according to the mission description, we must defend it at all costs. If it falls, the morale of our warriors will collapse. Now, personally, my gut tells me that if the enemy manages to push that deep into the city, I've probably already lost anyway, so my plan is to never let it get that far in the first place. But there's a catch. If I'm seeing this correctly, the Wonder can also be attacked. It can be ranged from the water by enemy cannon galleons. That means I can't afford to ignore the Spanish fleet for too long. Fitting for a climactic, decisive battle, we start out already in the Imperial Age. Tenochtitlan is well built up, with lots of structures available to produce units. But there's a major handicap. I'm limited to just 100 population. That makes this mission way tougher. Usually, in campaign missions, a low population cap just means that the game drags out longer, but here, it actually makes sense. Remember, many Aztecs had already died either from smallpox or at the Battle of Otumba, so it's realistic that we can't field huge armies anymore. The real challenge is obvious. With only 100 units total, including villages, I'll have to fight 3 different opponents at once, one of them attacking me even from the water. Honestly, that's too much for my taste, so my strategy is to focus on either land or naval dominance, but not both at once. Now, the case for going heavy on water is a strong one. If I can beat the Spanish fleet, my wonder should be relatively safe. The Spanish Navy patrols the lake with galleys and cannon galleons, and their docks are protected by some towers. But here's what my scouts discovered. There might be a weak point. It looks like there's a spot where I could land unnoticed and strike the fleet from behind. That's important because the causeway leading to their naval base has been destroyed.
We demolished the southern causeway to slow the Spanish advance.
The case for focusing on land, though, is also pretty strong. For one, I can start producing those troops immediately. I don't have any dogs. Well, I have 1 or 2, I believe. But that's not a lot, and let alone the upgrades I'd need for the ships. And on top of that, the opponent labeled Cortés' fleet doesn't only consist of ships. They've got land forces too, which means I'd need ground units anyway. So that settled it. I decided to begin the fight on land. Remember, I mentioned the 3 causeways leading from our city out toward the enemy positions? 2 of them are still passable. Cortés' main army is stationed to the northwest of Tenochtitlan. They fortified their camp with walls and castles, and my scouts spotted knights, conquistadors, missionaries, and bombard cannons. They also have transport ships at the ready, so if they can't break through via the causeway, they'll probably try to land somewhere else. Meanwhile, the Tlaxcalans attack across the southern causeway. Their base is poorly defended, which makes them the most tempting first target for me. With that plan in mind, I kicked off the mission the way you always should, with a bit of booming. I built up about 60 villages, then grabbed every upgrade I could, elite eagle warriors, elite jaguar warriors, the Garland Wars upgrade for +4 attack on my infantry. To free myself up to focus on the Tlaxcalans, I wanted my flanks as secure as possible, so I placed castles in the southeast to hold back the fleet, and another in the northwest to slow down the Spanish pushing in. Both enemies struggled heavily against those castles. I kind of feel like devs weren't prepared for such a defensive strategy, so I was able to stall them pretty effectively. My first offensive in the southwest targeted a small island where the Tlaxcalans had 2 barracks. I wiped those out, then pressed further south to take them down completely. They did have 2 castles and a town center, so I had to bring in trebuchets and keep them protected as well. But it went well. So well, in fact, that I got a bit overconfident. I tried to launch a simultaneous attack against the Spanish in the west, but that failed spectacularly. They sniped my traps, one after the other, and the whole push collapsed.
We have returned for the rest of your gold. Surrender now, or feel the wrath of our bombards.
Still, that was only a minor setback. Once I had finally crushed the Tlaxcalans, I could march that same army northward to tear down the Spanish fortifications in the west. After that, I turned my attention to the rest of the Spanish land army stationed further in the north. That part wasn't too difficult, just a little slow, since my troops had to trek up there first. When they finally reached the causeway and charged the invaders, it felt almost cinematic, like I was seeing a reenactment of La Noche Triste. My units clashed with the Spanish head-on, and when the enemy finally gave up, I felt this little wave of relief wash over me.
You are postponing the inevitable. The time of the Aztec Empire has passed. Look to us as your new rulers.
That left only the Spanish fleet. They were stuck with the same problem I had. With the causeway destroyed, they couldn't reach Tenochtitlan directly, and because I'd built castles along the shoreline, they also couldn't just land freely on my island. I did lose a castle or 2 to their cannon galleons, but at least I bought myself enough time to finally deal with the fleet on my own terms. My scouts had reported that there might be a safe landing spot across the lake, so I set out to find it while putting together a small fleet of my own. Of course, that meant retiring a large part of my land army to make room in the population cap. And when I say retiring, I might have, let's just say I might have dedicated them to the gods by pressing the delete button on my keyboard. Well, I needed to make space, so this was the only way. Since I couldn't just let them run into the enemy. Actually, I probably could have. I just had to build a few transport ships and send them over. Why didn't I think of that? That just came to me. I mean, even if the Spanish fleet had sunk my transport ships, that's still the same as me deleting them. But for some reason I felt this would be the fastest way. Just make room for pop space and then start building my own fleet. Anyway, that's what I did. The problem, though, is that building a fleet is quite expensive, especially in terms of gold, which was starting to run dangerously low. So I scouted outside of Tenochtitlan for new deposits, and I struck lucky. I found some gold on an island in the north, where I quickly sent a few villagers to mine. Along the way, I also stumbled upon 3 Spanish cannon galleons that have been abandoned.
The Spanish must have abandoned these warships during their flight from Tenochtitlan. Now we will use them to bring death to the Spanish by sea.
To be honest, I wouldn't know why the Spanish would abandon their ships that they had under very, very hard labor. Just built in this lake, but I'll take it. I would have loved to have those ships earlier, to be honest, but hey, better late than never. My scouts had already warned me that the Spanish docks were guarded by towers, so the captured galleons would definitely come in handy. And let's be honest, it always feels amazing to turn the enemy's own weapons against them. Fueled by this fresh gold, I built up a navy, focusing mainly on fast fire ships. Against those, the Spanish galleys didn't stand a chance. They were also kind of trapped in the lake and couldn't retreat very far, so one by one I burnt their ships down. But then I made a discovery that I wasn't really thrilled about. Cortez's fleet turned out to be way more than just ships. They had serious land support as well. They started to convert my ships from the coastline with Spanish missionaries, and worst of all, my 3 precious cannon galleons were sniped so fast I didn't even realize they were gone until I started to, press my hotkey and nothing happened. It was just too late. And for everyone familiar with the Aztec tech tree, they get neither cannon galleons nor dromons, so those 3 cannon galleons were actually very important. By the time I had cleared out the Spanish ships, I wanted to use my cannon galleons to blast their bomber towers, but, well, I didn't have any left. That was frustrating. It meant I'd have to cross with land units after all. The big issue? By then I had whittled my villagers down to about 20 and reassigned most of them to wood and gold, assuming I'd only need resources for water combat. On top of that, I may or may not have deleted my Eagle or Jaguar warriors, as I said, to make room for nearly 60 ships. Let's just say, when you already have total naval dominance, 60 ships is probably a little bit overkill. With the 100 pop cap, I had to rebuild from scratch. Thankfully, I kept my 5 trebuchets alive. I wasn't about to delete those, that's for sure, because they were hell of expensive. And you never know when a treb will save the day. I never did find the so-called safe landing spot, so instead I gambled on something risky. I loaded up my troops on transport ships and sailed straight between 2 towers. My traps squeezed into a tiny patch of safe ground right in between those 2 towers, while my heroic Eagle warriors threw themselves into the line of fire to buy some time. From there, I began my land campaign. The Spanish had built up a proper settlement here, to my surprise, complete with a strong economy, and they fought back with everything they had. They swarmed my siege with halberdiers, conquistadors, and battering rams, and all clearly aimed at taking out my trebuchets, since they must have realized I had no way to handle their castles and towers otherwise. And sadly, they succeeded. They managed to push me back, though they took massive losses in the process. They hurled their entire army at me in a desperate heroic defense, and in the end they did win that round. But not for long. I regrouped, ferried over another army, and this time brought some villagers along too. I built barracks right on Spanish soil so I could produce reinforcements on the spot. No way was I going to repeat my earlier mistake. With my Eagle Warriors, I focused hard on cutting down their rams, which endlessly targeted my precious traps. Finally, I smashed through their last stronghold.
We have done it! Tenochtitlan stands and the armies of Cortés are defeated! The Aztec Empire has triumphed! For now.
And so, in the end, I succeeded in defending Tenochtitlan against the Spanish and their allies, in a bloody, glorious, and wildly dramatic battle. The Aztec gods received many sacrifices that day, and they smiled down upon us.
Not so long ago, some 500,000 people called Tenochtitlan home. It is difficult to recall that this smoking ruin was once an endless city. Yet, we will rebuild. We created this island upon which our city and temples stand, and we can do it once more. The Aztec Empire has endured its greatest challenge, yet the Spanish may return in the future. I am not certain that there is a place for us in this new world. I could ask the gods for a hint of the future, but no doubt that would lead to more sacrifice, and I think there has been enough death for now. My people composed a poem to commemorate this great war that we have survived, and yet perhaps still not won. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. So says Cuauhtémoc, Emperor of Tenochtitlan.
It's a fitting end for the Aztec campaign, a very satisfying one. But, of course, as you all know, that's not at all how history really turned out. So, before we get into some of the unique features of this final mission, and then reflect on the campaign as a whole, let me tell you one last time how the story of the Aztecs actually continued. The siege of Tenochtitlan by the Spanish and their Tlaxcaltec allies began in May 1521. You already know the Spanish strategy. They encircled the Aztecs inside their own city, cutting them off from the outside world. The Aztecs, however, fought back fiercely, not only for their city, but for their very survival. And at first, they had their successes. At the end of June, Spanish and Tlaxcaltec soldiers were defeated on one of the causeways. True to form, the Aztecs did what they always did with prisoners. They sacrificed their captives and even their horses. This was a serious blow to the Spanish, since they lost not only men, but also valuable weapons and horses. But Cortés seemed to have endless luck. In July, yet another group of reinforcements arrived from Spain, a force described in the sources as large, though the exact number isn't given. They landed in Veracruz, bringing with them shipments of ammunition and new horses. This fresh wave of troops was absolutely critical for Cortés's continued efforts to conquer Tenochtitlan, arguably even decisive. Remember Diego de Ordaz, the man Cortés had sent back to Spain? It seems he had fulfilled his mission, because otherwise this reinforcement from Spain is quite hard to explain. According to the chronicles written by the conquistadors themselves, the siege of Tenochtitlan lasted about 7 or 8 months. 7 long months during which the Aztecs, isolated and starving in their own city, resisted with all their might. That's 7 months that serve as a testament not just to their fighting spirit, but also to the sheer architectural and logistical genius of the city of Tenochtitlan itself. Some sources even claim the siege dragged on so long because Cortés wanted to present the city as intact as possible to his king. Allegedly, he even tried diplomacy to persuade the Aztecs to surrender, but honestly, I don't really buy that. For one, Cortés knew full well that the Aztecs would fight bitterly to the death. And second, after they finally won, the Spanish still went on to almost completely destroy the city when there was no need for that. That hardly lines up with the idea that he ever truly wanted to preserve it. As the siege stretched on, of course, other cities in the region took notice. Many of them had suffered under Aztec rule, and so they decided to join the Spanish and bolster their forces. One source even reports that Cortés sent soldiers throughout the countryside to announce the siege of Tenochtitlan and the restoration of peace under his leadership. If that's true, it was a clever move. At best, it could bring more fighters to his cause, and at worst, it still boosted the Spaniards' reputation. And for those of you who care deeply about historical accuracy, let me add a little technical detail. It is documented that Cortés equipped the ships he used on Lake Texcoco with mounted arbalests. In Age of Empires 2, the Spanish actually have the weakest archers in the entire game. They can't even upgrade their archers to crossbowmen, let alone arbalests. Historically, though, Cortés' army included 84 horsemen, 194 arbalests and handgunners, hand cannoneers, and 650 infantry. So yes, he pushed that population cap way up. But even more impressive were his allies. Over 20,000 native warriors fought alongside him. And here's something that often gets swept under the rug in the history books. Things weren't always so rosy for the Spaniards' allies. In fact, the Spaniards were heavily involved in slave trade, reportedly holding multiple auctions to ship enslaved people from Mexico overseas. So it's not really a surprise that this eventually led to an assassination plot against Cortés. He found out in time, though, and afterwards it's said he never went anywhere without a sizable personal guard. So what did the fighting actually look like? Let's start with an early example, the Battle of Tlacopan, which took place fairly early on in the siege. The Spanish tried to push forward across one of the causeways, but the Aztecs managed to drive them back by attacking from both sides, get this, with their canoes. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, canoes? How on earth are canoes supposed to stand up against warships? And the short answer is, they can't, at least not if the warships are actually engaged in the fighting. But here's the catch. Cortés' fleet consisted of 13 large sailing ships, and of course, they could only move when the wind was favorable. In the long run, yes, the Spaniards managed to secure naval dominance, but in the meantime, the Aztecs' thousands of canoes gave them much greater mobility. The Aztecs also had an advantage of fighting on home turf. They knew the terrain far better than the Spanish, and they filled it with traps. For example, they dug deep pits in the shallow waters so that heavily armored Spaniards would fall in and drown. But once the Spanish gained control over the water, they could use their ships to land in areas the Aztecs hadn't fortified, simply because no one expected the Spanish ships to get there in the first place. This made Cuauhtémoc's defense strategy far more complicated than he anticipated. Still, the Aztecs weren't just on the defensive, especially at night. They launched surprise raids against their enemies, sometimes simultaneously at different camps. In these well-coordinated attacks, they killed some of their opponents and also raided them for food, and then retreated back to Tenochtitlan for safety. By this point, the Spanish had made hardly any progress in their siege and were growing increasingly nervous. Which brings us to the second key example of the fights, the Battle of Colhuacatonco on June 30th in 1521. This one was a major victory for the Aztecs, and honestly, I have good reason to believe that in this campaign mission, this is the battle we're actually replaying, not the very end of the war, but this exact moment. Here's what happened. After enduring constant Aztec raids, Cortés felt compelled to launch a full-scale assault. His advisors were split. Some urged him to go for it, others warned that it might stretch their lines too thin and leave occupied areas vulnerable to counterattacks by the Aztecs. In the end, however, Cortés went ahead with the attack. He ordered his forces split into 3 groups to advance along the 3 main streets leading to the Templo Mayor, which in the game is the wonder of the Aztecs, and the Great Marketplace. That division meant that each group was effectively fighting in isolation, unable to quickly share information about how things were going elsewhere, pretty much exactly like what happened in the campaign mission. Even if the in-game factions don't map perfectly to the real ones, this similarity is quite astounding. Cortés himself led the largest contingent, and at first, things went surprisingly well for the Spanish. The Aztec defenders retreated deeper into the city, which of course felt like a victory to the Spanish, but it also meant that they had to leave behind their horses, because going deeper into the city meant that the streets got more narrow and twisting. By the time they reached the marketplace in the city center, Cortés claims he already suspected something was off. It seemed far too easy to advance this far into the city. And he was right. For the second time, Cortés had been lured into the city, and this time the Aztecs had prepared an enormous ambush. And once again, the Aztecs showed up with canoes. These canoes were filled with warriors, surged through the canals of the city, cutting off the invaders' escape. The ground also had been deliberately turned into thick mud, causing the heavily armored Spanish to slip and struggle to defend themselves. And that wasn't all. The Aztecs had lined the shores with wooden stakes, preventing Spanish reinforcements from landing. The ships literally ran aground on these barriers. Absolute genius warfare, in my opinion, and it ties in perfectly, once again, with what I experienced in this campaign mission. Cortés's fleet would never manage to land on Tenochtitlan either. Although, that may have been because of the castles that I built along the shore. When it became clear the battle was lost, Cortés tried to order a retreat. But here's where the flaw in his plan really showed. With the 3 divisions separated, communication was a nightmare. While one of the groups was already set in the trap, the others were still approaching the trap, unknowing what was ahead of them. The Aztecs even managed to capture Cortés himself, but his men fought desperately to free him, suffering huge losses in the process. Some of his best men had to die in order to save Cortés from the Aztecs. In the end, the surviving Spanish and Tlaxcaltecs were forced to flee the city under heavy losses. And according to the sources, all of this unfolded within just a few hours, a gigantic trap set by the Aztecs, well knowing how the Spanish would approach an all-in assault on Tenochtitlan. Cortés almost lost his life that day, quite possibly being sacrificed like so many of the countless captives the Aztecs took during that battle. Eventually, the Aztecs decided to launch a massive counteroffensive against the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies. If it had worked, the political fallout could have been enormous. The allies might have abandoned Cortés entirely if he couldn't prove he was able to protect them from the Aztec attacks. For nearly 2 weeks, the Spanish held out under constant pressure. And in the end, they managed to survive, not through superior planning, but once again thanks to Cortés's absurd good luck. By mid-July, when their gunpowder supplies were running dangerously low, a Spanish ship landed in Veracruz, the Spanish base on Mexico's east coast that had been founded back in 1519. According to the American historian Prescott, this ship actually came from the expedition of Juan Ponce de León, who had just wrapped up his ventures in Florida. On board were exactly what Cortés needed: barrels of precious gunpowder, crossbows, and fresh soldiers. I mean, can you believe his luck? These reinforcements were then quickly brought inland to Spanish camps in the valley, and suddenly Cortés was able to mount larger offensives than ever before. Cuauhtémoc, the Aztec ruler, rejected multiple peace offers from Cortés, probably because he still remembered all too well what happened the last time Montezuma agreed to a peace only to end up under house arrest. But by early August, with food supplies finally running out, the Aztecs were forced into one last desperate attack. Severely weakened, they faced not only fresh Spanish troops, but also Cortés's relentless luck, and the offensive collapsed. And here's a fascinating side note. According to Wikipedia, citing a source I wasn't able to track down sadly, during the final days of the fighting, a tornado actually swept through the region. This is said to be the very first recorded sighting of a tornado by Europeans, but honestly, just imagine that. A storm raging above the last stand of the Aztecs. That's some bad luck. On August 13th, 1521, Tenochtitlan finally fell. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape the city, and from that day on, Mexico came under Spanish rule. The colony of New Spain was proclaimed, with Cortés as its commander and governor. After tempting fate more times than anyone deserved, after riding on sheer luck and leaving millions dead, whether by cannon or by smallpox, Cortés's dream of being a conqueror had finally come true. By November, rebuilding had already begun, though not as Tenochtitlan. The city was renamed Mexico City, just as it is named today. Just 2 years later, Spain launched a sweeping missionary campaign to, in quotes, spiritually conquer the population through Christianity. But what about Cuauhtémoc, the man who had fought so cleverly and stubbornly against the invaders? Well, no surprises there. After his capture, Cortés kept him on as a sort of puppet administrator of Tenochtitlan, much like he had done once with Moctezuma. Under torture, Cuauhtémoc was pressured to reveal where the Aztecs had hidden their gold in Lake Texcoco, but according to tradition, though, he never gave anything away. An Aztec warrior would never fold under torture, and how could they? They were expecting and readily happy to let their heart be ripped out when they were still alive. What can you do to these people to get information out of them? Eventually, he was baptized, forced probably, under the name Fernando Cuauhtémoc. Spanish authorities replaced every Aztec religious image with Christian symbols, and they began the long process of draining Lake Texcoco. In 1525, Cortés dragged Cuauhtémoc along on his expedition to Honduras, likely because he feared leaving him behind would mean rebellion. But while they were traveling, Cortés accused him of plotting an assassination. Whether that was true or a fabrication is unclear, but Cortés had him executed, sadly by hanging him, denying him a warrior's death. And that, tragically, is the end of Cuauhtémoc's story. For me, it leaves no doubt. I despise Cortés. I assume the worst of him without hesitation, so I go along and say that was all made up. Cuauhtémoc had never plotted an assassination, though I really don't know because there's no reliable sources to that. This, then, is the true story of the fall of the Aztecs. From the Spanish perspective, it's the tale of a man desperate to join the ranks of the high and mighty, who became a conqueror to get there. A man willing to betray his governor in Cuba, deceive his own king, even fight against his fellow countrymen. He promised his soldiers endless riches, but in the end he barely recovered a fraction of the gold the Aztecs had sunk beneath the lake. So his soldiers probably never got to see the riches that they had been promised. But Cortés wasn't just a ruthless schemer. He was also one of the luckiest men in history. Again and again, he narrowly escaped death. He could never have defeated the Aztecs on his own strength. Every time, it was reinforcements that tipped the scales. And in the end, the Aztecs only fell because starvation and disease crippled them. And for good measure, probably even a tornado was thrown in there. From the perspective of the Aztecs, it must have felt as if their gods had turned against them. They fought with what must have been superhuman effort to push Cortés back. And yet, they weren't just fighting with the Spanish. They were also up against the countless allies the Spanish had that they themselves had once tyrannized. From so many, and from my, so-called neutral position as a 21st century Age of Empires 2 player, I honestly don't know what to think. The Aztecs must have been cruel rulers, otherwise the rest of Mexico wouldn't have so willingly sided with the Spanish. But the Spanish weren't any better. Their greed for gold and their mission to Christianize the world left just as much destruction. In this story, there really are no good guys, only villains, and as in every war, it was the civilians who suffered most, the millions who were murdered, enslaved, or wiped out by disease. And that brings me to my final verdict on this campaign. Did it succeed in telling the story of the Aztecs? Not really. What it told was the fabricated Spanish version of the conquest of Mexico. The Aztecs didn't come across as nearly cruel enough, in my opinion, considering how much hatred must have been directed at them by their neighbors. Instead, the campaign made them and the other Mesoamerican people look, almost simple-minded, even naive, when in reality they were as clever and brave as they were brutal. It's a shame, really, that so many events were left out or changed. The biggest example, of course, is the final mission, which basically implies that the Aztecs managed to defeat the Spanish. But now that I know more about the siege of Tenochtitlan, I don't actually mind it too much. After all, up until the Battle of Colhuacatonco, that victory was almost possible. So when I finished that last mission, I just imagine the ending credits rolling on the evening after that battle when Cuauhtémoc still had hope. Still, I wish the campaign had acknowledged this somehow so it wouldn't leave the players with the sense that it was completely rewriting history. But putting historical accuracy aside, was the campaign fun to play? Well, that depends on what you're looking for. Personally, I love the fact that you get to fight in Tenochtitlan twice. And the geography of the maps felt surprisingly fitting, at least within the limits of what the game can represent. I really enjoyed battling through the jungles and taking advantage of the rich resources scattered across the maps. It always felt great when I could outsmart the Spanish or even capture some of their units. The campaign does start off a little slow, but in my opinion that's forgivable, probably just a marketing choice more than anything else. The difficulty is marked with a single sword, which feels fair. In a year, I'll probably only remember the battles in Tenochtitlan. Nothing else was especially memorable to me. That wasn't the case when I was a kid, though. I know it left a big impression back then. For me, now, the enjoyment didn't really come from the challenge, but more from the setting, the Aztec Empire, and the nostalgia. Playing this campaign really brought back some childhood memories, and in a way, I think I've now put those memories to rest for probably the next decade or so. As a campaign, I'd say it's perfect for newcomers to the game. It'll feel like a solid challenge probably for them, but anyone going in should know, as history, it's kind of weak. As atmosphere, though, it does deliver. Before we wrap up this campaign, let's end, like always, with a few fun little details about this last mission. So, first question, what actually happens if you lose the Wonder? At the start, the game tells you that your unit's morale would drop, but honestly, nothing really happens to your troops. Instead, something way weirder kicks in. The Tlaxcalans instantly get 2 technologies for free: Fabric Shields and El Dorado. That's just wild, because in this mission, the Tlaxcalans are, represented by the Aztecs. They play as the Aztecs, so suddenly they're unlocking the Imperial Age unique technology of both the Incas and the Mayans, and if they get their own Aztec unique techs, that's a lot of technologies. Their Eagle Warriors turn absolutely busted. Fabric Shields gives them extra armor, El Dorado adds extra bonus hit points, And if you throw in the Garland Wars, the actual Aztecs' unique technology, they'd also get bonus attack on top of that. Total chaos. But that's not all. No reason to stop there. The Spanish get their own free power-ups too. Cortés' land army suddenly gains Cataparuto, the Japanese unique technology, in the Imperial Age, so their trebuchets fire faster and can pack up and unpack quicker. Meanwhile, Cortés' navy gets artillery, the Turks' Imperial tech, which gives their cannon galleons 2 additional range. And on top of that, they get Carac, the Portuguese Castle Age unique technology, so all their ships gain extra armor. The sheer amount of free upgrades is overwhelming, but to be fair, it also makes sense. It's the game's way of signaling that once the Aztec wonder falls, the Spanish invasion becomes truly unstoppable. It might seem a lot, but I love little touches like this. The only shame is that, in practice, the wonder never really felt threatened. With the 100 population cap, it was simply too easy to hold off 3 enemies at once. Oh, and let's not forget the 3 cannon galleons we found up north. Those only exist in the definitive edition. Before that, in the original campaign, you'd find 3 turtle ships instead, which, let's be honest, were way less useful than cannon galleons, even if I managed to lose mine embarrassingly fast. So why on earth there were turtle ships on Lake Texcoco is still a mystery to me. But I came across a theory on the official Age of Empires forum from the lore expert Tomo Chocolate, and it made me laugh so much that I've just accepted it as canon. So the theory goes like this. Orlu the Wolf, yes, the same one from the Mongol campaign who also pops up in the Aztec one, somehow escaped to Korea, stole 3 turtle ships, and sailed them all the way back to Lake Texcoco over the course of 315 years. When the definitive edition came out, they actually patched this lore detail because historically turtle ships hadn't even been invented yet at that point, so the developers swapped them out for cannon galleons, and to make it all consistent, they even added cannon galleons as a Korean unit in the update that came along the Lords of the West DLC. Yeah. Honestly, Tomo Chocolate, that was a piece of brilliant theory crafting. Although it's probably not true, and it's probably more of a fan service or fun fact to promote another civilization, the Koreans who also were put in the game with the Conquerors add-on with this very campaign. And now, to end this campaign season on a more poetic note, we're closing this series with the poem of the Broken Spears, the same one Cuauhtémoc referenced earlier. But before I read it to you, thank you all so much for listening to this series. It's been a pleasure to have you along our journey through the rise and fall of the Aztecs, their battles, their strategies, and the legacy they left behind. If you enjoyed walking in the footsteps of Cuauhtémoc, hearing about the relentless conquest of Cortés and the gruesome Aztec religion, and learning the stories behind each mission, you can help keep this podcast alive by supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/startthegamealready, patreon.com/startthegamealready. You're not just funding more episodes, you're helping bring history and gameplay to life. Your support allows me to dig deeper into the campaigns, explore more civilizations, and share the rich, often overlooked details of history that the textbooks and the games leave out. So if you've enjoyed this season, consider becoming a Patreon. Just choose the tier that is right for you, because just like the Aztecs fought to preserve their empire, you can help preserve these stories for the community. Every contribution makes a difference, and I thank you for being part of this adventure. I'm closing this episode, as promised, with the poem Broken Spears, written by an unknown Aztec poet after their defeat in Tenochtitlan. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are reddened with blood. Worms are swarming in the streets and plazas, and the walls are splattered with gore. The water has turned red as if it were dyed, and when we drink it, It has the taste of brine. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls. For our inheritance, our city is lost and dead. The shields of our warriors were its defense, but they could not save it. We have chewed dry twigs and salt grasses. We have filled our mouths with dust and bits of adobe. We have eaten lizards, rats, and worms.